So it is my great honor to welcome to the show author and musician Gary Lachman. So, Gary, welcome to the Pop Apocalypse. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and thank you, Matthew, for inviting me to be on the show.
Yeah, we're very excited as we were talking about before recording. Longtime reader and fan of your work. And one of the things that we like to do on this particular show is sort of take a biographical look at our guest. And so there was never going to be a better time to invite you on than when you had just published Touched by the Presence.
Mm.
So this is going to go pretty seamlessly. But I always start out the show with the same question, although I'm going to tweak it a little bit because of the memoir. So I always ask about somebody's religious upbringing and how it influenced them later on. Um, and I would ask you about that, but having just read Touched by the Presence, it's clear that you've come to see that comics, reading, television, sci-fi, and fantasy, these are the things that really sort of formed you and put you on
Mm.
this specific path. So, how is it that your early exposure to comics, fantasy, sci-fi, and that led to your eventual interests in esoteric intellectual history?
Well, just for answer that, I'll say I was brought up Catholic,
Hmm.
so if that's I think until I made confirmation, and I think until I was about 13, then I kind of stopped going.
Okay,
So that was
13.
about it. But I don't have any. I don't feel like I had walked away with any sort of Catholic guilt or any of that sort of thing. But comic books. Yeah, I mean that was the awakening for me in the beginning. I would say of introduction to pretty much what I've been pursuing my whole life and what I wound up doing in now since I've been living in London for 30 years, writing these books. Not necessarily about comic books, but about many of the ideas, the simple themes, and the story I tell is it's well, one thing I'll tell is I knew I was reading at least at the age of 5. And this is because I remember the change from comic books being 10 cents to 12 cents. And that ended it, or that started, I think, at the towards the end of 61 or something. And I was born at the end of 55, and I still would have been technically 5 at the time. And comics always predated a couple months ahead or of the actual time. They had a
Hmm.
weird kind of their own calendar sort of thing. So, in any case, I figured it out that I was at least because there was a particular issue of The Flash, and he was one of my favorites. And I got 10 cents from my grandmother, and I went to get it, and the guy said it's 12 cents, and I had to go back, and she didn't want to give me the other 2 cents, and I really had to fight for it and all that. So it was like one of these moments you remember. And but that puts me at the age. But I remember there was a character in the Legion of Superheroes, and they weren't necessarily one of my favorites, but I remember them. They were in like the back pages of adventure comics, and Superboy was in them, and they were teenagers from the future, and predating the X-Men. The X-Men, teenagers with superpowers and all that.
Hmm.
And but one of the characters was Cosmic Boy, and his powers were magnetism. And I didn't understand why he wasn't called Magnet Boy or Magnetic Boy. It was very logical. There was Lightning Lad, he shot lightning bolts. There was Sun Boy, and he was, fire or something like that. So it all made sense. And I didn't like, what's the cosmic bit? Um, and I asked my sister, who was a few years older, and she didn't know. I asked my mother. She didn't know. I didn't bother asking my father. And I just figured you could say, well, I've been trying to figure that one out for the last 65 years. What does cosmic mean? But I mean, it was the sort of thing where it was an opening to other worlds, other
Hmm.
realities. I mean, if you look at the stories and all that, I mean, they seem childish from one point of view, but it's all
Hmm.
about the future, other planets, uh, beings with strange powers, and I later came to see them as sort of models of self-actualization,
Hmm.
in a sort of sense, kind of like sort of like be all you can be kind of thing, which sounds cliched. But I even wrote an article about this many years later for the Times Literary Supplement here when I was introducing my sons, who never became comic readers. They're victims of the digital age, so it's all everything on the phone and all that. But when they were very young, I introduced them to DC world through, and also Marvel, but mostly the DC through the Justice League
Yeah.
Cartoon Network series, which is one of the best things ever done, as far as I'm concerned. If you ever see them, I mean,
Mm.
the animation may seem by now dated, but the actual integrity and authenticity and kind of they really were loyal to the sort of storylines in many ways.
Was this
Any
the
case,
Justice
so
League of the 90s? Or like,
the Cartoon Network, so it would have been like the early 2000s.
oh, cool. Okay. Because I'm very familiar with the
Um,
Batman from the 90s, which is
Well, there was the
excellent.
Batman, and
Yeah.
then after that, I think there was a Superman series, and then I think
Hmm.
they did this Justice League and then Justice League Unlimited, which was like they had practically every character in the DC
Oh, very cool.
universe, and I'm sure they're available, but I mean
Hmm.
I have them on CD. I have this there's the 20th Century Room down the hall here. It has all the CDs and everything. But in any case, it was like they were just this incredible gateway to this larger sort of universe and larger kinds of ideas about reality.
Hmm.
And a favorite character of mine, who wasn't necessarily a superhero because he didn't have superpowers, but I think he exemplified the romantic kind of idea about life, where there's everyday, the triviality of everydayness, as Heidegger calls it, but then every now and then there's some opening to a much more interesting, fascinating, magical, strange world out there. And this character is Adam Strange,
Hmm.
and he's an archaeologist. And one day he's digging away. I forget exactly where it was, in the Andes or someplace like that, some remote site. And he's hit by this beam from outer space, the Zeta beam. And it sends him to another planet, Ran, which is,
Hmm.
I think, an Alpha Centauri or something like that. And there it's like Flash Gordon, or it's like, the Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars,
Hmm.
stories. There he gets involved with the beautiful woman, gets involved as a kind of hero, has a nifty rocket pack and ray gun and all that. But then after a certain time, the effects of the Zeta beam wear off and he's sent back to Earth. So even though he has a
Hmm.
fascinating life as an archaeologist,
Hmm.
which you might say might satisfy his romantic urges, he spends the rest of his life figuring out when the Zeta beam where it's next going to hit.
Hmm.
And it's always in these remote places, so Antarctica or wherever he can get to it because of his, day job, as it were. But it's just this romantic sort of, to me, it struck me later on that this was the metaphor for this romantic view of life, where there's this mystery and strangeness,
Hmm.
There's this everydayness, which is dominant in 99% of life is that, but every now and then you get, these kind of flashes of this other sort of way of living. And so that, I was indoctrinated with that or infected with that at an early age. And that later went into just fascination with comics in general. And I think my interest in history, insofar
Hmm.
as, I mean, I'm not an academic historian, so I don't know. I write about dead people. One of the things I talk about this book, Kevin talks about, it says, most of my books are about, other people and they're dead. Well,
Hmm.
this one's about me and I'm alive. So it's a very strange, different kind of thing for me. But it's, historical in that sense. These are figures from the past. And I
Yeah.
became interested in comic books in the 30s and the 40s, because in the back pages of the comics when I was a kid in the 60s, this was the beginning of comics being collectors, collectible kinds of things. And there were these catalogs for, you know, not old issues of comic books from the 1940s or something. And I somehow became, I guess today we would, I don't know if it's there in the States, and here in the UK, there's something called hauntology.
Hmm.
I
Oh, yeah.
only know
That's a
about
thing
it
here.
on the fringe. And so it's kind of like being fascinated with the immediate past, if that's, if I'm not
Hmm. More or less, yeah.
incorrect, something like that. So, I mean, so I was doing that long before it had a name, because I was interested in the past of, say, 10, 15 years 20 years before me, the effects of which were still around, obviously.
Yeah.
But one of the thing about the 60s, which I said in this book, and I also say in my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, which is about the occult influence on pop
Hmm.
culture in the 60s, is that so much of the popular culture that I grew up in the 60s was from earlier time.
Hmm.
Like the Marx Brothers, things I would see on television. So the miracle of television, that had all these old kinds of movies. But they were picked up by the hippies too. I mean, I remember, my late teens going to, sort of film nights at the local college, and it's like two Marx Brothers films, and everyone's smoking pot and it's stoned out and all that kind of thing. And so it's like all this kind of old stuff got somehow revitalized
Yeah.
in the new kind of counterculture sort of thing. And you can see even in the comic books themselves, figures like Captain America and then others who were from that time being brought back in. So it was, this otherness or strangeness, I don't know what we want to call it, magic, mystical, but it's also wonder, which is, the source of philosophy, the beginning of philosophy, plus this notion of the past, the history. So those things somehow inculcated in me or stayed in me for, later on.
Yeah, that's really
But yeah,
cool.
that was in a long answer to your question about comic books. Yeah, so there you go. Sorry, I
No,
went
we
on and
only do
on.
long answers here, so I appreciate that. Um, no, that and it's really rich, and there's a lot of ways to go. So yeah, and just to sort of riff briefly, we've you've talked about it. Others like Jeff Kripal have talked about it. We also end up finding out that the people who were behind a lot of these comic books were having these esoteric interests or these sort of
Mm,
mystical type experiences and then embedding them in the work. So there's this interesting sort of recursive
mm,
process that's
mm.
happening there
Right.
that's really interesting. And you bring up also, this is a little segue. You bring up turn off your mind. So, after childhood, after high school, you eventually find your way to Manhattan, and you become bassist in a little band called Blondie, which has a nice little career, you could say. Um, and so, actually, I'm gonna try and answer or ask this question, even though it's kind of big. So you write about turn off your mind, this sort of like occult intersection with
Mm,
rock, right? And
mm,
then there's a lot of that same exploration when it comes to metal and the occult.
mm,
I
mm.
haven't heard as many people talk about what the role of the occult was and the esoteric in punk and new wave, like within that culture. You would obviously be in a position to do that if somebody was going to talk about it. So, was it there, or was it just kind of people might be handing around Crowley books or something like that, but doesn't have the same sort of, it's not saturated in
Yeah.
the same way as the
Well, I
60s or
mean,
metal might
be
be.
honest, I mean, it was something that I was doing. I mean, I was a kid. I was 19,
Mhm.
reading about this stuff. So it wasn't until a bit later when I moved to Los Angeles where weird things happen on the West Coast that I got involved and actually started practicing some things. But so you have to see me as kind of 19, like, wow, what is this kind of learning
Yeah.
about it? So I mean, it was my encounter with it was kind of like what I later called like the debris of the not necessarily the previous generation, but just whatever like the last 5 or 6, 10 sort of years.
Mm.
So on bookshelves, people would have like Timothy Leary or and some stuff I had already read in high school, like Castaneda or stuff like that. But there was kind of or the copy of the I Ching or something like that. And I mean, in punk per se, I wouldn't say that because it didn't strike me as that would have been like they just would have considered that rubbish or something. I mean, there was not mystical, but the poetic, sort of French symbolist
Yeah.
side to people like Patti Smith and Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell in the very early days. But it's more poetic, on that kind of thing, not necessarily occult per se. And I just got interested. So, I mean, I know I've heard stories about other people around at the time stuff was going on, but I didn't know about it and I wasn't into it. I mean, um, I know there was one of the bookshops there. Again, this wouldn't have been in the punk world, but it would just in the occult world. Excuse me, the occult world. It's a place called Magical Child. Um, that was near the original Barnes and Nobles on Fifth Avenue, like 18th or 19th Street or something like that. And there's all the supposed to be goings on in the back room, which subsequently turned out to be something like that. I've heard. I've just on the occult grapevine. There's a couple books out about that. But for myself, no, it was more like I just became introduced to this sort of thing when I moved in with Chris and Debbie into what became known as the Blondie Loft on the Bowery, just the block south of Houston, so like a block or two away from CBGB. And the fellow had the lease on the building insofar as anything like that. was this wild, flamboyant gay biker artist who was into the Hells Angels, but he was also into Crowley, and he used to do tarot readings with the Crowley Thoth deck, and he would read from Diary of a Drug Fiend and things like that. And I just became fascinated. I hadn't had any introductions. I mean, I wasn't into magic before then. I read a lot. I was always reading. I was a voracious, addicted reader, but and I liked Lovecraft and like the Weird Tales kind of crew, but I didn't take magic and that kind of stuff seriously. Um, but then it just was like, ooh. And then I saw Crowley's book, Magic in Theory and Practice, and it was one of these things that's same time, it's equally baffling and fascinating. You sort of have no idea what he's talking about, but it's like, well, I kind of like to know what it is. And even that book, I say in Touch by the Presence, that even the influence of comic books kind of affected me there because if you know his book Magic in Theory and Practice, there's on one of the opening pages, there's different symbols of the magician in the robe and different kind of postures, but it's a line drawing. I think from taken from a photograph, but it's a line drawing, and to me it looked like some character from a comic book. Because that's the hood on is a star in the hood, and it's all these weird kind of positions. And I thought, oh God, he looked like some character in a superhero or something like that. Um, but then the thing that sold it for me was coming across Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, which was published in 71, and I came across it sort of summer of 75, let's say, so not too far off from when it was first out. And it was such a good read about all this sort of stuff and all these figures like Gurdjieff and Madame Blavatsky and Rasputin and Crowley and Yeats and the Golden Dawn and Nostradamus and whoever. And well, more or less philosophical, scientific approach to it, but not in any dry academic way. It's a compulsively readable, as as the book reviewers are often asked to say. Compelling, and I couldn't, literally couldn't put it down, and I just became fascinated with it. And it was a great time to become interested in all this stuff because it was available in all the bookshops. Weiser's was the big occult bookshop in Cooper Union in just, whatever in between Greenwich or in East Village. Near the Cube. I don't know if the Cube is still there, but it was not too far from. It was like Broadway. It was Broadway. It
Oh,
was
okay.
around that, so up that way. Yeah, not right by the Cube. So I'm sort of my psychogeography is a bit off. But that was the great. I mean, then they were a publisher too, but also all the bigger book like Barnes and Noble or other. And there were many different sort of independent bookshops, but they all had occult sections and cutout tables. And there was a lot of reprints of public domain titles, so they were very cheap, and it was all the classic stuff. So I just started reading it, and once I get interested in something, I'll just start reading about it as much as I could.
Yeah. So, um, there's so much to get into regarding books here, but I want while Crowley came up, I did want to ask first. So the introduction to Crowley, is that what ended up bringing you into sort of like practical magic at the time, like starting to do stuff? Or did that take a while?
Well, let's see. Well, the story behind that is when I left Blondie, I moved to Los Angeles to be with my then girlfriend, Lisa Jane Persky, with whose presence I was in touch. We were in touch with these other. But this is just to say that's the allusion to the Blondie song, "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear." So it's a song about Lisa. She and I were having these telepathic experiences. 1977, when I was on the first North American Blondie tour, and we were opening for Iggy. Basically, we were having shared dream experiences, and we would know when the other one was going to telephone. And this was back in the day, well before mobile phones or cell phones. And so you had to be at a certain place at a certain time to send or receive a telephone call. You had to be in the hotel room or home, or in a phone booth. But there wasn't nothing like that. And funnily enough, whenever I went to call her, she was about to call me. So I had these kinds of experiences, and but an actual kind of magical practice. Well, I moved to Los Angeles, and again, there used to be a great bookshop on Hollywood Boulevard called Gilbert's. And it wasn't solely occult, but they had a very, very big occult section. It was an antiquarian collector's bookshop as well. And people like Jimmy Page and Bowie and the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, who were all uh, Crowley fans, were clients and bought stuff there. And so I would frequent this place. And again, this is well before the internet, and they had an old-fashioned bulletin board, people, push pins and putting up notices on index cards. And I saw something for a Crowley group or something like that. So impetuous Capricorn that I am, and never the armchair magician, I thought, okay, what the heck? So I just sent them some, hey, I saw your whatever. What are you about? And whatever. I don't remember what I sent, a postcard. And not too long after, there's a knock on the door of the house I'm sharing with Lisa and a few other people. And this unprepossessing um fellow asks me if I was ready to, commit to the pursuit of the knowledge and conversation of my holy guardian angel, which is an odd thing to be asked. After opening the door, someone knocks it. It was sort of like a Jehovah's Witness asking if you wanted to join or not. And so I had to think about it. But then I thought, all right, well, why not? Yeah.
Mm.
So sign on the dotted line. And I don't mean to, be sort of facetious about it, but it is in retrospect, it is kind of odd. But I, took it seriously and saying the book that I was initiated, I believe, by Grady McMurtry, who was um, fellow who knew Crowley in Crowley's last days when he was living in Netherwood,
Mm.
which is it's not there anymore, but it was like a boarding house on the coast here, a place called Hastings. Actually, there's a book about that. Netherwood, the last resort of Aleister Crowley, and I contributed something to it. And he was in L.A. He met Crowley when he was in the army during the war years. He was stationed over here, and he was interested in magic and all that. And then he later in Los Angeles, he helped sort of keep the OTO going. And then later in late 60s, early 70s, I don't know the exact history, got it going again, sort of revamped it. And I can't say for certain, but I believe he was the one who, performed this. So I actually had some contact with someone who knew Crowley, which doesn't mean anything, but sort of it's an odd kind of thing. I mean, in fact, the guy who in the Blondie loft, the biker artist told me he introduced me to somebody who he said was one of Crowley's, offspring, but who knows? I think he spread his seed far and wide. So if it, well, whatever, if it's true at
We've
all.
all met some sort of Crowley
Yes, yeah,
seed
yeah, yeah,
at some point.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so in any case, I was initiated into this, and I took it seriously, and I had, the robe, and I was doing all the in the back of magic and theory and practices, various different rituals and exercises and things of that sort, and so, and but after a while, um, I mean, I tell the story more detailed in an earlier memoir called New York Rocker. Um, Lisa said, you must be out of your mind. The guy who, got involved with, he turned out to be, a poor example, let us say, of the thelemic attitude towards life, or a good example, depending on how you take it. But he was a sort of little Crowley himself, and it all went south, or it all went pear-shaped, as they say here. And so after a while, and then I found Crowley claustrophobic after a while.
Mm.
It's just it's all roads. I mean, that's why he's a good raconteur. I mean, if he's a good storyteller. But after a while, everything is just funneled, towards him. And I just got a bit tired of his personality. But I was a dutiful student. I read all the poetry. I mean,
That takes some work.
that's a
That's
tough
tough sledding,
road
as they
to
say.
hoe,
Yes.
let me tell you. So, but any case, but then I just kind of dropped out of it. I moved back to New York. The relationship at Lisa ended. I moved back to New York and I was kind of between for a while. And my band, we were, the No, KNOW, the name coming from my interest in Gnosticism, at the time, the little I could understand and know about it from what was, well,
Yeah.
this is before Elaine Pagel's book, but it was in
Uh,
the air and things of that sort.
yeah. Do you mind if I ask
Um,
you like a little inside baseball question? Technically, what I do is reception of Gnostic stuff in
mm,
America, so this is kind of very interesting to me. So, were you reading like John Dart's books, or
no,
Jonas, early Nag
well,
Hammadi stuff?
Hans Jonas, I read Elaine Pagel's. I mean, later, Stefan Heller. I mean, this is
Yeah, especially if you're
in
in
the 80s.
LA. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to attend his talks on Friday Eve when I worked at the Bodhi Tree Bookshop, which was, the most famous metaphysical bookshop west of the Rockies. And I was working there, and he had these Friday evening things at the Gnostic Church on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, only in Hollywood do you have a Gnostic Church on Hollywood Boulevard. And he would lecture on everything. He was brilliant. He would lecture on existentialism, Gnosticism, magic, Blavatsky. He just listened to him talk. He was great with this Hungarian accent. He's still going. He's still
Yeah, he
strong.
is.
He's still going. He's in his 90s, and he's still, as far as I know, I think he's doing his services on Sundays for the Gnostic
Yeah.
Church up in
At
the
a
Any
certain point, he
Besant
said
Lodge.
he was going to start a memoir himself. But I haven't seen it come out yet. So, but that's been
Yeah,
like 5 years ago.
I've heard that as well, and I've inquired about that, and I've said, that if he should get his skates on, as they say here, and
Yes.
get it going. But um, I'm trying to think at the time. I mean, this was just sort of on the cusp of the Nag Hammadi stuff coming out, that being discovered and being translated, and so yeah, I was sort of, I mean, just again, it's the kind of thing I was like 21, 22, sort of like, oh, wow, so that was the sense of the name of the band. And but we were a pop band, but there wasn't any, I mean, in the lyrics, I mean, there's some slight, not necessarily, oh, we had a song in the know as well,
Mm.
I would give up everything to be in the know or something like that. But it's not, not necessarily I would give up everything to be a Gnostic, but it was this whole notion of having, direct knowledge, direct experience, and that in a very general kind of sense. And I had, one or two experiences where I would flock up to being something like that, but um, uh, nothing that I would call mystical, much more kind of, and it's something I've been written about more recently. Just a more vivid, grasp of actually where we are, where you are right now.
Mm.
I mean, that sounds horribly cliched and all of that. And this is why we don't have a language to talk about these kinds of things, which is a whole other issue you can get into. But again, it's knowing and knowing. There's knowing, then there's knowing, or there's knowing in italics, or there's gnosis or episteme and all that sort of thing. Um, but in any case, that was yeah. I was kind of on my own when I was doing this, and then when I got to LA, I did that, dropped out of that, went back and forth, and the next sort of how should we say system that I kind of joined and practiced for was the Gurdjieff work.
Mm.
And that was longer. That was a few years, and that was much more interesting and got more out of.
So what would it talking about this sort of fuller sense of things, like really knowing something, like in terms of gnosis, just an experience of things, naturally led into this discussion of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and this sort
Mm,
of like being. So
mm.
you mentioned that you got much more out of it. What did you get out of having practiced the work for a few years? What was it that you felt changing inside you? How did it sort of transform?
I certainly had, I would say, a few very clear and convincing and indubitable. I love
Mhm.
that word. There's a Daffy Duck cartoon. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, I'm vamping off to tangent here, but there's a Daffy Duck cartoon, Warner Brothers cartoon, where he says indubitably, and
Mhm.
I'm trying to find it on YouTube, but I can't get it. But in any case, no, an indubitable moment. of like whatever you want to call it, wakefulness, gnosis,
Hmm.
uh, um, you know, you know, and to me, it's more important if you have a few of those that you know, and you can say incontrovertibly, whatever. I know this happened. Then you're reeling off your latest mystical experience, or whatever that might be. And I can say one of them certainly came from when I was practicing the Gurdjieff movements.
Hmm.
For the brief time that I was doing them. If you know them, the kind of, it's that, times 10, when your hand and all this is, and again, I'm doing it quickly, and I have nothing but respect for this. And But I tell the story in the book, and this is when I was in Los Angeles. I first was involved in New York, and I was still living in New York, and that would have been like 81. And then in 82, I moved. I was moving back between LA and New York quite a bit in the early 80s. And then in 82, I moved back to LA for the longest stretch until I moved here. And in LA was when after a while, after being there for a while, I was introduced to doing these movements, and they're quite difficult. If you've ever seen any of there's probably some videos of them on YouTube. There's the Peter Brook film Meetings with Remarkable Men, and there's a section in that where there's a performance of the movements, and they're very angular. They're not necessarily aesthetic. They're not necessarily like ballet or I mean, there's eurythmy, which is something that Rudolf Steiner does, but they're not even graceful like that. They're very sharp, almost percussive or piston. I would think like piston-like kind of movements, but they're very, very difficult. In any case, you learn some, and they keep increasing the difficulty. The number of body parts you have to move in unusual, ways to a very strong pulsing piano rhythm sort of thing. And one evening trying to do this new set, and I just felt I couldn't do it at all. And no, I can't do this. I just no, okay. I'm just trying and failing, and then say, okay, no, that's it. And then tried one more time, and then sort of bang, I hit it. It hit, and I was doing them, and I had this incredible rush of energy. And Gurdjieff himself used to talk about what he called the great accumulator. And he had his own sort of weird, psychophysiology of the human body. And he said, so in us, we have something he called accumulators, which accumulate energy, like, gas tank, petrol tank. And you use one up, you use one up, you use one up, and it gets empty, and there's another one, and that taps up the other, and then after a while you run out. But if you make a certain kind of what do you call the super effort, an extra effort, you go that extra mile, you can connect to the great accumulator, which is this, inexhaustible source. And in their terms, that at least for me at that moment that it happened, I suddenly just felt so. The way I said it, I was so, as they say here, I was so full of beans. I wanted to get in my car and drive to San Francisco and back just for fun.
I've never heard this full of beans. That's wonderful.
I was full of bean though. I mean, I don't know if even they say it here. This is like an old, Brit kind of thing. He was full of beans. He was like, ready to go. Like he had his Wheaties, or something
Mhm.
like that. But I later, and this is through Colin Wilson's work, because he made this connection. If you know William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, there's this wonderful essay in the early 1900s called "The Energies of Men," with energies of man, or something like that. But it's about it's basically a study of second wind. When athletes or runners, they're going, and they just can't. They're out of it, can't do another, and then suddenly, bang, they hit a fresh gas tank, and then, boo, they can go, and they can do the marathon again and back. And similarly with this Gurdjieff method of pushing you to keep making these efforts that you don't want to make. You have to break through the frustration. You have to break through the resistance, the reluctance. to do it. But once you break through that, then that's, this other energy comes in, and that's much like what James understood by second wind. So when I put those two together, I said, okay, it doesn't matter where this energy is coming from, whether it's the great accumulator or wherever it comes from, where James is saying it's coming from. But the process of getting to it, both of them are talking about the same thing in different ways. Gurdjieff developed a system, a method of applying it. It's kind of like artificial crisis or induced inconvenience. And I mean, I did this book about Maurice Nicoll, who was started out as a Jungian a century ago, more or less, and later jumped ship and became a follower of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. But he spent time at Gurdjieff's Priory, the famous Institute for Harmonious Development of Man in Fontainebleau outside of Paris, which I visited in 1983. And he himself says, "Oh, this Gurdjieff, it's the method of frustration, in the sense that it builds up a kind of frustration, and it somehow that crisis or that inconvenience gets you out of your artificial self or your mechanical self, and that rush of energy, in a way, you can say is when it's you. You are there, not Wilson would say the robot, Gurdjieff would say not the machine, whatever. It's the self, not the persona, whatever it might be. There's a variety of different ways of talking about the switch from one to the other, but it's a sudden freshness, a sudden alertness, but it's also a sudden, just actually, influx of energy. So, I mean, that was one thing that I mean, it was similar sorts of things. That was one thing that I could say, okay, I know that happened
So,
to me.
so one a question that I wanted to ask you specifically. We did a whole like Gurdjieff 100-year anniversary of his trip to Harvard event last year, and I've interviewed a number of
You mean
other.
Jung? You mean Jung? You mean
No, no,
Jung?
no, no, no,
Not
or Gurdjieff. There was
Gurdjieff
a,
came to Harvard?
I think, or well, I may have to edit
Oh
this
no,
part out.
maybe he did. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No,
No, no, no.
excuse me.
So
I
there
mean,
was a
no, no.
big there was a 100-year anniversary of something, which is why
Oh,
we
yeah.
get put on a Gurdjieff conference last year with
Okay.
major they did, Gurdjieff song cycle, they had movement,
Oh,
the
really?
whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, there was scholars giving talks on Gurdjieff. And for this particular show, I've interviewed a bunch of writers, artists, and Gurdjieff is everywhere. He always comes
Hmm.
up.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
my curiosity is,
Hmm.
and let me phrase this, even with musicians where they're not using any of the Gurdjieffian scales or trying to,
Hmm. Hmm.
embody Gurdjieff's music, they're just influenced by the practices and then bring it into their work.
Hmm.
Do you see anything in particular about the Gurdjieff work that seems to blend so well into making art, writing books, or because
Oh,
it,
certainly music. I mean, because
yeah.
he himself composed, and Thomas de Hartmann, and it's usually Thomas de Hartmann's transcriptions of Gurdjieff's. He had this harmonium, this kind of
Mhm.
accordion thing that he would play something on, and de Hartmann would turn it into piano music, and then that would be all. That's usually what you're doing the movements to,
Mm.
something along those lines. So, I mean, there's that, and I mean, well, I don't know. In one sense, writing books. I mean, many people wrote books, but a lot of people stopped writing.
Mhm.
Or at least two of his closest, like Ouspensky. Ouspensky
Mm.
basically, I mean, gave up writing. I mean, he worked on what became known as In Search of the Miraculous, from the 20s until he died. And he rewrote earlier things. He put together a new model of the universe. You've got there.
Mhm.
It was, if you see the dates on the end of the chapters, it's often like 1910 and 1922 or something. You know what I mean? Something like that. So that was the book he was working on when he bumped into Gurdjieff,
Mhm.
and he had to put that on ice until. Oh, excuse me, that's the wrong word. Had to put that on the back burner. Um, uh, uh, until after. his work with Gurdjieff, and then he went back when he was here in London. Say around this 100 years ago, this time he was living in an area called Barron's Court in what they call a bedsit, which is a smaller place than I've got. Working on and searching miraculous, and then wondering what to do with the material from a new model of the universe. Maurice Nicoll too, as I mentioned, not as well known, but he wrote fiction. He wrote novels. He wrote strange stories. There was the Strand magazine and things of that sort. But one of the things I talk about in my book about him is somehow he became very what's the word? And he had horrible writer's cramp where he couldn't bring himself to work on things. So those are a
Oh,
couple different things.
interesting.
But I mean, certainly with dance, I would say things with dance, with music, perhaps with art and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't work in that, but it's kind of like I think in a certain sense, Gurdjieff said, well, if you know how to sew a basket, much better than if you can go and write a book. It's like that sort of
Mm.
not anti-intellectualism, but the kind of, at least saying, well, yes, we know you're very smart, but can you use your hands? So developing these other parts of ourselves and that kind of thing. But no, but so I would say certainly, I mean, the when I first got involved in it, the fellow who was sort of the leader of the group I was attending, he was one of the teachers of the dancers, and he was also a painter.
Mm.
And I remember when I couldn't say now what the paintings were, but I remember seeing when I went the first time meeting him in his flat. I mentioned it in the book as well, that the
Mm.
walls and the flat are filled with these fantastic paintings in this kind of Oriental, sort of sense and all that. So I think in that sense, certainly, yeah. I mean, but there's other. I mean, like Rudolf Steiner. I mean, it's a lot of art involved in that as well.
Mhm.
Um, but you must know that Robert Fripp from King
Yes, of
Crimson,
course.
he was a student of Bennett's. But um, Richard Lloyd, one of the guitarists from television, is very, very deeply interested in the Gurdjieff work. I mean, I only
Mm.
subsequently came to understand that through the miracle of Facebook, when we're just sort
Really?
of
Yeah, because I was
chatting,
saying I
and
hadn't heard this before.
I would posted something because I was, gave a talk about it or did this book on Uspensky or something along those lines, and he came up and exchanged sort of things, and it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, okay. I mean, but I knew him at the time, but I didn't know him well, but so I didn't know this about him back in the day, but subsequently, and it's what do you want to say? There's a kind of discipline, maybe I
Mm.
think that might be the attractant in some way. There's a kind of discipline to it that's uh, yeah,
So,
for certain people, I think that's a strong attractant, and it's something that you can apply, I think to music as well, because there's obviously a certain discipline
yeah.
to be able to play musical instruments.
I mean, I feel like
Unlike
there's,
me, who just banged away at it.
well, maybe you return to guitar after years in the work and see what happens to come of it. Um, no, I mean, I feel like there's a really rich reception of Gurdjieff in the arts sort of book that's just sitting there waiting for someone.
Yeah, I mean,
This
well, I
sort
mean,
of
that's
uncultured.
Peter Brook, the film, okay, he's the
Yeah.
filmmaker. I mean, there was, I do remember at a time though, it must have been John Cassavetes. I don't know if he directed, but he was in a version of The Tempest. It
Okay.
was an updated contemporary, and it might have been 1980 or something like that. But there was just a off side remark about Gurdjieff, with this actually kind of ditzy. I haven't seen the film in ages. Ditzy kind of blonde woman kind of mentions, "Oh, I'm into Gurdjieff," or like that. But I'm just saying this at the time because it tends to keep a low pro. I mean,
Yeah.
it was in the papers in the 20s and the 30s and all that, but I think in the contemporary time, it tended to keep a low sort of profile, and it still does. The Gurdjieff Foundation is, they're no, rightly so. They're very serious, so they tend to
Yes.
keep a low profile, not get publicized and all that. But certain, no, I think you're absolutely right. In all architecture and in all these sort of fields, it's something that um, I remember Jakob Needleman.
Hmm.
He was passed away some years ago, but
Yeah,
he
just a
was
little
over in
while
San
ago.
Francisco. Yeah, but he was very much involved
Oh
in,
yeah.
in that. in the work and all that. And I know he there was some, I can't remember what it was called now, but there was some anthology that he edited,
Yeah, I know what you're. I know.
a variety of
Well,
different, sciences or arts or whatever, something like that. It's kind of, wide range areas of the way in which Gurdjieff's ideas have been influential.
I know exactly what book you're talking about, but not the title. I'm going to put that in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
show notes. That's
yeah.
fun. So Jacob Needleman just came up. I interviewed Cynthia Bourgeot last.
Hmm. Hmm.
And anyway, I studied under Jacob Needleman when I was at SFSU. He was a really
All
interesting
right.
character.
Okay. Hmm.
Um, so we're talking in a certain way, all of these different figures that we've talked about are leading to a figure who's had a very big impact on your life
Hmm.
in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
Colin Wilson.
Hmm.
And he's come up a number of times. So first, let me say thank you for bringing so much attention back to him. I ended up tossing my copy of The
I see
Outsider
that.
up
Yes.
there.
Yes. I see.
You know,
Yes.
when I remember reading when I'm like 18 years old and, just like making sense of the world, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And the, how to say it, the territory that he ended up tracking has become has really flourished in sort of like esoteric studies and intellectual history, but he's still not as well known. Like he just
Hmm.
doesn't have the same sort of
Yeah.
stature that you might expect. So I love the fact that you keep bringing attention to it.
Hmm.
So I have so many different questions on Colin Wilson, but I just kind of want to open the door here.
Hmm.
How did you come to Wilson's work? I guess we talked about that, but what was it that sort of really grabbed you and helped you find yourself within Wilson's work, even before you met him?
Right. Well, I mean, when I read The Occult, I said there was just the general fascination with this whole, history of and these incredible characters and all the possibilities of human consciousness. But it was one in particular that stuck with me. That's something that he calls faculty X, and it just means it's a faculty of the human consciousness that we don't have a name for. And he calls it our ability to grasp the reality of other times and places, meaning that reality, we tend to think reality is what's immediately right in front of us. When you think about it, reality extends. We don't know how far it extends. How far the furthest galaxy is from us. We know that bit right in front of us now. We sense that, we see that. But when you think about it, that's not the end of reality. So in a certain sense, we're hypnotized by what's right in front of us. And this faculty X is this strange ability that hits us every now and then when we become aware of larger areas of reality, not necessarily some supernatural reality, something like that. So that was something that stuck me because it's the Proust experience. If you know, in the beginning of Remembrance of Things Past, when the Proust's narrator, he tastes a bit of this cake, it's called a Madeleine, in a bit of like herbal tea. And it brings back the memory, and what is that? What is that? And suddenly he remembers what it is. And when he was a young boy, when he was on holiday, his aunt used to give him a taste of her Madeleine dipped in the tea. So the thing is, he knew factually that that had happened. If you asked him, Marcelo, when you were however old and you were there, do you remember? Oh, yes, I remember that. May we? But that wasn't, it didn't bring the fact back to him. The reality of it came back to him. So you could say HD, 3D, VR, whatever feeble attempt we tried technologically to grasp, a more vivid reality. It was more than that. It came back to him. The past came back to him in that way. And it's not necessarily nostalgia for the past, but it's this ability to grasp a wider range of reality. So that idea, fundamental idea, for some reason that stuck with me, and all the different examples he gave of it. It's in Hesse, it's in Arnold Toynbee, it's all these different examples he gave. It just stuck with me when I was reading this book. But that was initially reading the occult was in the context of my indiscriminate reading about everything to do with the paranormal and the occult, anything I could get my hands on at the time. So it was books about that, Crowley, Golden Dawn, parapsychology, flying saucers, whatever. Morning of the Magicians, which is, uh, as a friend of mine said, it's a crap book that changes your life. It's a very bad book, but it's one of those books. Wow, if you read it at the right time, you know. So any case, so that was in that context. But then later, when I moved to Los Angeles, and I had left Blondie and um, hadn't yet put my own band together, I came across a copy of The Outsider, and I think it was precisely that copy that you've got there.
Mm,
That edition, I think it's a Delta, if I'm not mistaken.
right.
Um,
I can see. I mean, you don't have to stop. Yeah, it's a
no,
Delta
no,
book.
yeah, there we go. Right, okay. So I even said I came across that edition, and I just okay. So I remember buying it, and I just read it, and I just identified
Mhm.
with this character type that he called the outsider. And again, all these people that I had read about are in this book. So a lot I hadn't read about, but Nietzsche's in there and Hesse is in. I mean, I was a Hesse, casualty in the early 70s, like millions of other American adolescents. And I just read. I mean, I still go back and reread them today. But I was so. Oh my God, he's reading about Hesse. Um, Even writes about Gurdjieff. And this is before the Occult. This came out in 56. The Occult came out in 71. So Wilson was one of the first ones to write about Gurdjieff from someone outside of kind of the work. People had written their accounts, you know, their own personal accounts or something, but not someone looking at it. And also, incidentally, he's one of the first ones to write about Hesse in an extended English kind of, critical manner because Hesse wasn't even in print at that time as much. So Wilson's Outsider was one of the things that helped start the Hesse kind of revival. Well, he was a bestseller just before. It's just after he died again. He was like posthumous bestsellerdom, and it was like the third time, in any case, going on about it. But I just identify with this character that he called the outsider, and it's someone who's basically had an appetite for kind of meaning and purpose that couldn't find, in the world, and had to create it, had to have some kind of creative life. And again, I'm 22,
Mhm.
or on my way to be 22. So, I'm reading it at a time. And I had become an outsider. I had left a band that was on its way to become, successful. I was back where I started from again. I was, Lisa, she was on her way to in her acting career. So we were like kind of back to stage one, both of us together there. But I was determined to do it. And that reading that book, reading about these different characters, fictional, but in real life as well, Nijinsky and Van Gogh and Lawrence of Arabia. When I was that was one of the first films I saw when I was a kid. I was, oh, I didn't know all the stuff about him and Peter O'Toole. I had Peter O'Toole in my mind when I was like reading the book. If you know the film, the David Lean movie, he plays Lawrence. So again, it was just powerful, and it had this intensity. Um, that I thought, yes, I either am or I want to be, or I will make myself one of these characters. Do you make yourself it, or are you ready? Do you discover yourself? Have you lost yourself like the house keys, or do you make yourself or something? So that all that sort of thing. And I had already been reading Nietzsche. I had a high school teacher, my last year of high school, who took me aside and started giving me books to read. And he taught the rest of the class whatever the regular curriculum was. He was a young guy, a progressive. But he's giving me Sartre and Nietzsche and Camus and all this kind of stuff. And he's testing me on that. So I'd already had a background reading that kind of stuff when I was 16 and 17. So a few years later, coming across it again in Wilson's book, The Outsider, when I'd already read his book, The Occult. And one of the things that got me in The Occult was that he mentions Sartre. He mentions like Heidegger. And Heidegger was like somebody I was mispronouncing. It was like some name I was mispronouncing, but I had come across it in, something about Nietzsche or somewhere or something like that. And so what's that doing in a book about the occult? So that was like that strange kind of thing. And I didn't know that Wilson had already had 15-year, as it were, career writing about existentialism and things of that sort. So I discovered that when I came across The Outsider, his first book. So I went back to that. And then after that, I hunted down all of his books, and again, LA was a good place to do that in because there was at the time many, many, many secondhand bookshops. And then when I got my band together, whenever we went on tour, any of that kind of thing, I would just hunt down. I would get up early if there was a bookshop in town. Not every place did have one. And
Hmm.
if they did, I would go. So that was, that was it. I just became fascinated with all that.
And how did you, as I understand it, you guys became friends?
I mean, but without I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for reading his books. I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and that initially manifested in writing poetry.
Hmm.
Most of which I've managed to destroy. I did allow one to appear in a footnote to give you some idea that wasn't joking. I was actually writing poetry. But then that turned into writing songs, and I wanted to write, but I couldn't write anything that anyone would read. But it was through reading him, and then just, I mean, he had lots of fans, and there were people that visited him quite a bit, and I made a I made a pilgrimage to where he lived. He died in 2013. I made a pilgrimage to where he lived in a small place called Gorin Haven, which is in Cornwall, which is the far west country here of England, the furthest west tip. And when I was here in 1983, before I was living here, I was living in Los Angeles, and I came here on a kind of what I call the mini search of the miraculous. I went to places like I visited the site where Gurdjieff's priory was in Fontainebleau, Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame. I was into sort of sacred geometry and the symbolism that are in the Gothic cathedrals and all that. I was reading a lot about ley lines and earth magic and megaliths, and then I went to Avebury and Stonehenge, and I went to Glastonbury and further down like Cornwall, there's Mary Maiden, and I had an ordnance survey map. So I was, I was a proper ley line hunter and all that, and compass and all that kind of thing. So didn't discover anything, but it was fun to do that. But while I was down there, someone at a bookshop here in London had given me Wilson's phone number because I was talking to him about him, and I bought like a bunch of his paperbacks or something like that. And he said, "Oh, he loves visitors." And now I realize the guy was saying, "Yeah, Colin, I'll send another one down to you." But he enjoyed people visiting him, and he had this big place that he and his wife Joy they originally got in 1957 when he was hounded out of London. I mean, the outsider he came out, he was very popular. He was kind of like the Elvis Presley of existentialism here in England. And he was in all the newspapers for a while. And there was a whole scandal where he had to leave London. I can't go into the details, but he wound up moving down to the far west country. It was very remote then, and it was still relatively remote by the time I went down there. But it had a big kind of sprawling, house with like bungalow and different stuff like that. Books, like more books than you'd see outside of a book, ever see outside of a bookshop. It's just like so many books everywhere. And no, I mean the first time I went there, I remember we stayed up late, drank a lot, and he explained his ideas about phenomenology to me, which at the time I believed I nailed. But the next day I had no idea what he was talking about. Yeah, I got it, but all that. But he developed his own particular application of Husserl's phenomenology to create what he called a positive or a new or evolutionary kind of existentialism that would pick up where existentialism, Sartre and Heidegger and others had left off in various cul-de-sacs. And actually, I just was talking to someone earlier today about possibly doing a course on this because I did one for CIAS a while back on Wilson, and I'd like to do one about in the context of existentialism in a certain way and bring just that existentialism, pursuit of meaning, search for meaning,
Hmm.
basically, and his particular thing, which brings in what do you want to say? Ideas about consciousness that extend beyond, into the paranormal or into the mystical and things of that sort. And I think in some ways that, well, Henri Corbin,
Hmm.
scholar of Iranian Persian mysticism, he started out as phenomenologist. He was the first one to translate Heidegger into French, I believe.
He was.
And you can see a lot of that kind of, that the Husserlian sort of bracketing or whatever that attempt at seeing things without the preconceptions can bleed into or gradient into the sorts of visionary experiences, things of that sort. So something along those lines. So if I can do a course like that, I'd be interested in doing that.
Oh, that would be great. Just one of the things as I was reading your book is we are sort of ripe for some sort of Colin Wilson renaissance. I think it would be really interesting.
How long has
I,
he been dead? Let's see. It's 13 years he's been dead. So
yeah.
maybe, yeah, it could be, could be.
Well, I'm speaking as someone who, was
Yeah.
trained in
Mm,
esotericism, PhD, knows all the folks
mm,
at
mm.
Amsterdam, etc.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like I've never heard a paper on Colin Wilson.
That's the
I've
thing.
never
That's the
heard him
thing.
in a class, never in a seminar. It just never, and it wasn't even on,
Well,
you
I
might
wonder
be
if the
curious
yeah,
in.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
Jeffrey might. I just wonder for like people. I don't know. I mean, I like Vuta Honograph, who I know.
yeah.
I haven't talked to him in years, but I just wonder if that's a little too pop or something. I remember somewhere Anton Fave, who
Mhm.
the doyen of academic, is sort of making some sort of derogatory remark about Wilson or something like that. So it's like too popular. So, but
Yeah.
I mean, to me, the interesting stuff is in the popular culture because, so like Jeffrey said, this is the real avenue or venue or conduit through which these things come out, into the real world. Goes that
Yeah.
way,
I
everyday's
mean,
life, and yeah. Well, I
it,
mean, I was going to say a good friend of mine, Colin Stanley, is Wilson's bibliographer. He established the Colin Wilson Archive in Nottingham University. So at some point, people will discover that. I bet there's going to be some eager, thesis student who needs something, and oh, nobody's touched him yet, and so.
yeah, that great idea. And
Hmm.
is that also what became of his library? Because you talk about his library as having 80 to 100,000 books,
Oh
and it's
yes.
really hard to
Oh
find.
no, no. Well, it became of Colin Stanley's pristine collection of all of Wilson's books. Wilson's own books.
Yeah.
I don't know what the status of them now. I know I helped a few years back uh, put in dehumidifiers and help. No, it was like they're facing a crisis, I think, because it's down, it's very wet down there.
Yeah. And
And
it's
I think
really
that
hard to
they're not knowing
relocate.
what to do. And I'll tell you, if there was a place to house them, I think they'd be happy to find somewhere to do it. I haven't talked to them in a while, but I know there was
Mhm.
something like 60,000. And then he had these sheds out. There were books in the house. Then they have like an old caravan, basically like what they call a camper van. That was
Mm.
like that's full of books. Then there was the chateau that I was in was full of books, and then he had these two sheds.
Well,
There was the Crime Shed, which I thought was a great title. That was the shed with all the books on crime because he wrote about crime as well. But that was a great title, The Crime
that is
Shed.
so perfect.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's a shame because the
yeah.
digitization sort of energy has meant
Mm,
these private libraries, they used to be
mm,
taken up by universities. They're
mm,
just not. It's
right.
a
Mm.
huge shame. So we've
It is a
talked a
shame.
bit about universities and
Mm,
esotericism and esoteric studies. So one of the really interesting things about your place in that is that on the one hand, you've written a staggering number of books, 25, or did you write one this morning and it's up to 26? Or
Well,
so I want to make
I
sure
think that touched is 26, I think.
20, okay, there we go. And you did it all without the benefit of an academic position. So you're in a really interesting position to comment on the, a lot of people who do esoteric studies struggle with this. What do you think are some of the limits of being in academia, the things that you wanted to avoid, and when some of the benefits of remaining sort of on the outside, right, of the academy, properly
Mm,
speaking, and working as an intellectual historian from your own
mm.
space?
Well, initially, my career choice after rock and roll was to teach philosophy. That was what I was originally going to do. So, in 1984, when I came back from this mini search of the miraculous in Europe and such and such, and what to do it myself. So a friend suggested, well, you read all these books, why don't you go back to university? So I wound up going back to university and I decided to study philosophy and I enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed the undergraduate, the BA. I really enjoyed doing that. It was a lot of fun. And lots of stuff that I read randomly. And this was like, okay, now, people I probably would have avoided, like Leibniz or something. Okay, at least, forced to read it and that kind of thing. So I wanted to get a good grounding in it. Um, Different things happened. A marriage happened, and that kept me from going. I was originally wanted to go to Stony Brook, to because they had a good department in continental philosophy. That's what I wanted to do. But I wound up staying in LA because I got a relationship, and I wound up starting um, PhD track in English lit at USC. And by then, I guess when would this would have been 92, something like that. Um, PC thing had started to kind of happen, and I wasn't interested in deconstructing anybody. And I was like an old humanist romantic who's like, no, what did Blake mean? What is he? So it was just, I just was a fish out of water, and I just sort of felt, oh God, I don't think I'll ever get a job because I just don't want to do any of this kind of stuff that people are doing. I just don't, just doesn't appeal to me at all. Um, so that was like it just in my own kind of world, that sort of turned me off to continuing, and that had nothing to do with esoteric studies. I mean, I was reading that kind of stuff on the side, but for a while I was reading a lot of George Steiner, but not Rudolf Steiner, and I was trying to understand Walter Benjamin and people like Adorno and all this kind of stuff, and Derrida and that kind of thing. And I just thought, well, I don't I don't really want to have to go and do this stuff. If this is what it's going to take for me to get a job somewhere, I don't really want to do this. And this is a to think about touched by the presence. This was when miraculously this royalty check, substantial royalty check for that song appeared, and I could go. I don't have to do this for a while, and I quit and I tried to write a novel. But as for the esoteric, I mean, the thing, it's, I don't know, I guess because my own introduction to it wasn't through academia, it was through you know, it was through a wild, gay, flamboyant biker
Hmm.
artist on the Bowery in the context of rock and roll and all of that. So it was context like pop culture and all that sort of thing. So I mean, I wasn't asked to join a secret society by an emissary or something like that. I was reading, cheap paperbacks about all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I guess I like to keep I not consciously, but I sort of that just seems to be the context, and it's the freedom, it's the freedom where I just don't feel. I mean, I've been in some things with there's one with Wouter and
Hmm.
I think some other people in it. This is a while ago. I think it was Copenhagen, and we were doing something on Hilma af Klint,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
the Swedish artist that was like she was making the rounds then, and we were there giving talks and something. And I think at the end, like the person who was moderating say, well, we have to ask, we've come to the time where we have to ask that really basic question. I mean, like, do you believe in any of this stuff? And the academics are kind of, well, and I said, yeah, of course I do. And I pointed to the audience and said, so do they. Why do you think they came out here? This kind of thing. And I was
Hmm.
kind of like, and I sort of said, like, and these guys, they do too, but they don't want to say because they're afraid they'll lose tenure. And so I was kind of a bit, not combative, but wanted to shake things up a bit. And I said, of course. Like, what's the point? I mean, I'd rather err on the side of that than err on the side of no. Put it that way. So I mean, I guess in a way Jeffrey's different. I mean, because he is out in the open about all
Oh,
that,
yeah.
and I know in here I know his books get reviewed in the Guardian,
Yeah.
places who are they're God they're very very left and all that. They're not usually interested in all that kind of jazz. So good for him, and
Yeah, I
other
mean,
people like
he's
him, or you yourself,
well,
and that sort of thing. But
yeah, I mean, he's had a number of students like me,
yeah,
and doing what you can, but I mean, Jeff is his own thing. All right,
yeah,
he's
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like his own publishing industry, and
yeah.
um, it is still, I suppose you could say it's getting better, but it's still sort of expected that
Mm.
people who are coming through the esoteric mystical studies are going to be what Wouter might have been speaking to was the methodological agnosticism.
Yeah, I
Like,
know.
I don't know, I don't know. And it's, it's completely fair and necessary
Yeah, yeah,
for the
sure.
project to be getting tenure.
No, no, no. I mean,
But
no, no.
underneath,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
uh,
No, no.
I,
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, no, but underneath the things that are published, things are different. That's what we
Yeah,
all
yeah.
know.
No, I
Um,
had this thing when I aged. Turn off your mind. I actually interviewed Anton Fave
mhm.
in a cafe outside the Sorbonne. And at the end of it, I sort of said something like to him, like something like along the lines, "Well, do you believe in these kinds of things?" He said, "No, no." And he was, it's not a matter. It just was. He was very indignant about it and all that kind of thing. So, no, well, funnily enough, though, there's academic publisher Palgrave,
Mhm.
Palgrave Macmillan. They recently asked me to do peer review of two manuscripts. They've been submitted to them, and they were interested in whether they should be published or not. About one was about the link between sort of the, the writings about Victorian ghosts and psychic phenomena and the phenomena themselves. And and it was, God, it's Fish, Stanley Fish, and some weird the thing that made me run away from, English studies in graduate school, some weird theory
New
that
historicism.
I
No,
can't
was
remember. It's
it?
something about how it doesn't matter whether the phenomena are real or not. These kind of interpretive communities
Oh, okay.
established a reality of these things, regardless of any so-called empirical evidence of them, which made me say, well, there actually is quite a bit of empirical evidence. And there was another one about similar thing. But I thought it was odd, and I said to him, look, I'm not an academic. I have no idea where this fits in to current studies in this. I wouldn't be able to tell you whether or not. And they say, oh, no, no, the authors insisted you look at this. They said, please bring, because you could bring outside peers in. And I said, okay, fine.
Oh,
So
nice.
I'm an authority, but without an academic, at least an authority for a publisher to ask, whether they should publish. And I gave him a thumbs up,
Very
even
cool.
so even though I said I have no idea what Stanley Fish is talking about, but I'm sure it's okay.
Nice. So I can't let you go without asking you about dreams.
Hmm.
Um, so the yeah, so many of your books are about a particular figure and intellectual history, etc. But then dreaming ahead of time is doing, you're really after it, right, with this nature of things. So, um, keep it keep it simple. What do you think these precognitive dreams tell us about the nature of consciousness? Just keep it simple.
I think they tell us that our everyday consciousness, where time streets seems to go in one direction, not necessarily false, but it's not complete, put it
Mm.
that way. So there are other levels of consciousness and time. And I agree with J.P. Priestley. Although J.W. Dunn, who wrote this book, Experiment with Time,
Mhm.
which was the one that I read in 1980, which got me to record my dreams, in which I started to see I was dreaming bits and pieces of my own future, not predicting anything, but just things that would happen to me the next day or the day after. Um, he had this idea, this kind of, infinite number of selves and times, and because there's always the self observing, the self. But the British author of J.B. Priestley, who was fascinated with time, he called himself a time-haunted man. He said we only need three. So there's the everyday one, where time's only in one direction. Then there's the dreaming me, the dreaming observer, in which you're lifted out of that stream, and you can see the back, the past, and you can see
Mhm.
the future too. But it's your past
Yeah.
and it's your future. So it's not Criswell predicts. It's not that. It's just what's going to happen to you. And then there's the next level is one in which you can act. And you could take advantage of what you've seen on its way to you to avoid it if necessary, or make sure it happens or something along those lines. And he tells the famous story of the woman who had a dream when she was camping and she had an infant child with her and she needed to wash some things. And so she went down to the stream and, oh, she forgot the soap and she went to put the baby down saying, I'll be 2 seconds. it's far enough away. It's not going to roll into the water. She goes back to get the soap, comes back, and the baby had rolled into the water in the dream.
Mhm.
So not long after, she is camping. She does have her infant child. She does need to wash some things. She's on her way to the stream. She remembers the dream. And she goes back and gets the soap. Well, she has the kid with her, and none of that happens. But she had an opportunity to change the possibility of what's going on. So I'm not a determinist in that way. I think we don't always do this. I mean, most of the time we are mechanical. Most of the time we are, our future is pretty much the same as our past. But we can have. I would even say I mentioned earlier that my place was, going through all this kind of. I mentioned, right,
Yes.
that my place was going through all this kind of. Even that, the upset of that, the fact that I'm camping out here, you can't see it, but I'm camping out in my living room on the couch here, and everything is different, and workmen are coming in and out of the place, and everything is, and I'm going out most of the day. Even that slight bit of inconvenience
Mhm.
or a slight bit of disruption to the everyday routine, I caught myself have this feeling of thinking, what is this? I feel like I'm on holiday, which is
Oh,
exactly what I talk about in. I wrote Nick. This is a book that's coming out later. It's with the publisher. It's not. I finished it early this year. It's a shorter book, but it's with them now. I delivered it ahead of time. I dream ahead of time, and I deliver books ahead of time as well. But I had this strange experience a few years back when they had the first lockdown here, the first COVID lockdown. And I have the great good fortune to have a garden flat. So I've opened my door here, and I have a little garden, private garden, excuse me. And it opens up to a bigger communal garden. So one morning, it must have been March. So it must have been whenever that was. Was it 5 years ago already now? 6 years ago?
yeah, about
I
five.
think it's 2020.
Yeah.
Um, I went out during the lockdown was going on, and so I was doing all the things you have to do, wearing the gloves and riding my bike out to find little shops that had anything left because the big shops are completely, the hoarders that got to it and all that, and cleaning everything. So a variety of different, again, inconveniences. Um, had to make a slight effort, Gurdjieffian style, a little
Yeah.
extra effort. And I remember walking out here, cup of coffee in hand, going out and looking up, and I said, "What is that?" And it was the sun. And I was utterly surprised. Just, I didn't know what it was for a few nanoseconds. I was like, what is that? And then I started, I realized what I had asked, and then I started laughing. I was cackling. But it was this I was surprised by it and its presence. Oh yeah, I know what the sun is. It's 93 million miles away. It takes 9 minutes for its light to get. I know all those facts, but suddenly it struck me as this actual thing there. It was almost as if I could hold it in a certain way. It was that kind of vivid and clear and concrete. And I chalked that up to um, as I was saying, this kind of alertness that came from the inconvenience, having to put a little bit extra effort. And at the time, I even was thinking, what do I feel like? I just everything seems a bit more vibrant. It's, oh God, I feel like I'm on holiday, even though it was crisis. It was the last thing for many people, a holiday. But it felt like holiday because holidays generally, you go somewhere else and it's a different routine. Scenery is different. That's not the case. Although it is a bit different. I've got the other half of my library is on the floor behind me right here. So, so that times two is on the floor behind me. So it is a bit different and all that. So any case, I'm going on and on, but this is the sort of thing. This is Wilson's. This is the result of his phenomenological analysis of what he calls the robot, which is this handy labor-saving device that we develop in order to take care of things, but it does its job too well and it starts doing things we'd rather do ourselves. But that morning when I walked out, my robot was off duty because I was in crisis mode and I had to be more there, and somehow my being more there resulted in my seeing, well, the sun was more there too. So, in any case, this is long-winded comment about all that, but it's that similarly here, I found myself feeling this kind of strange, I guess, happiness and sort of like what, and
Mhm.
everything, my place is completely, a tip. It's horrible. It's dust. I'm going to be cleaning for weeks here and all that.
Mhm.
But somehow I realized, yeah, well, you wanted to change, didn't you?
Yeah.
You've got it, and suddenly it's the slightest little bit of upset to the routine has inculcated this in me. Now that I've analyzed it, it'll probably go away because I'm aware of it.
Well, savor it while you can. And
Exactly.
it really sort of captured you have the Colin Wilson part. It's very Gurdjieffian.
Hmm.
This like inconvenience to just take you out of that sort of
Hmm.
mechanical mode of being.
So
Um,
I guess the next
it's,
step is, can you do that without the inconvenience? I guess that
y-
would be somehow bringing in imagination, I would say, in some way. But in any
mm.
case, that's the next talk. That's the
Well, is
next
that your next book? So
conversation.
I wanted to
That's the
ask as
next
a
book.
last question. So I was going to ask what you were working on, but it sounds like you already have a book in. So our guest choice. Do you want to tell us about the book that is coming out next that's with the publisher or what you're working on now?
Well, I'm not working on a new book at the moment. It's this other thing is with the publisher, but I think they
That's
haven't
fair.
got back to me about it yet. But it's sort of along the lines of, what I'm talking here. And it's based on this experience that I had being surprised by the sun, and
Nice.
it's an unpacking. It's an unpacking of that in different kinds of contexts. So it's a bit of Zen is in there, a bit of existentialism and being and all of that. The search for being as if it's lost in some way and things of that sort. So
Yeah.
something along those lines. But there's a couple of things happening. I was asked by the Italian publisher of my book Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of you know who,
Mhm.
and they asked me to bring things up to date for a new edition they're putting out. So I waited to the very last minute to submit it. Usually I'm ahead of time, but I had to say because
Who knows what can
events are
happen from day to
unfolding. Yeah, I
day?
know, I
Yeah.
know, I know, I know, I know. So I did that, and then I was asked by there's a there's a group well, they're in the Netherlands and Germany. It's a Rosicrucian group, but they have a website called Logon, Logon, and they ask me to write things every now and then. I did one about what I call the portable cave. It's not out yet, but it's a take on the whole simulation, kind of
Ooh.
meme that's very rampant these days and all that. So little bits and pieces, and I'm next month in February on Sundays I'm doing a four-part series for the Philosophical Research Society
Hmm.
in LA. Do you know them? Manly
Uh,
P. Hall started them
yeah.
back in the 50s, and but they're going strong now, and they're actually very good. They've kept themselves going, and they have a, how should we say it, more inclusive kind of profile. They have lots of different things happening. It's a fantastic old kind of Art Deco Mayan building in Los Feliz in LA, but they have an online presence. So I'm doing a series. It's Ancient Alexandria, and
Hmm.
it'll
Very
be
cool.
Hermetists, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, and I'm calling it Secret Christianity or Christianity before Rome. So, and it's all this
Mhm.
melting pot of all these kind of things happening in Alexandria in say 200 around there, that kind of period. So
Super, super cool. And is that you're going to be teaching that as part of the online?
that's
That's
online, yeah. So
okay, cool. So
it's up. I think if you just me and Ancient Alexandria, it'll turn up. There's an Eventbrite site. If you're
nice.
interested, it'll give you
Yeah,
details and all that kind of thing.
and
Yeah.
we'll definitely put that in the show notes. We love ancient Alexandria on the show, and as part of TNT, it's a very big
All
part
right.
of what we do. So,
Hmm.
well, Gary Lachman, thank you so much
Well,
for the
absolutely my
rich
pleasure.
reflections. And yeah, everybody who has not already needs to read Touched by the Presence or pick up one of your other 25 books. They are, though I
Well,
can't claim
get
to have
touched
read.
by the presence, and then no doubt you want to read all the other ones. So
Yes, very well put. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the
my
show.
pleasure. Thank you, Matthew. Take care.